Hello friends and fellow artists. This is Art and Wine with Jaime Byrd. That's me. This is my wine. This is my art. And today I'm going to continue in this series that I've been talking about, which has to do with art shows. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to apply for an art show and what's necessary, and a few tips on how to get into an art show. If you like art and wine and being creative and talking about creative stuff, please subscribe and hit the notification bell, and I'll let you know every time I put out a video. So in this video, I want to talk more about applying for art shows after you've decided which ones you want to do. There is a link here and down below in the description about another video that I did on how to decide which shows you may want to do. The first thing I did when I started applying to shows was I would see what the requirements were, and at that point then decide if that was the right show for me. So now I've already made that decision, and now here's a show that I've decided I'm going to do, and basically it requires slides. I'm thinking, what do you mean slides? Who does slides? Is this 1965? How do you get a slide out of your phone? That was pretty much how you had to always apply for a show. These days, I don't know if you have to still do slides. I absolutely know that you can do mini shows just by applying digitally online. I know now that there's an actual online source for applying to shows, and it's called Zapplication. And if you go there, you can actually apply for a show, submit your jury fee, and often your booth fee if that's what the show requires, but also just submit your photos of your work digitally, which is huge for me. No matter what, if it's slides, photos, physical photos, or digital photos, you're gonna want your photos to look really, really good. And the idea behind that is to make sure that if you are not a professional photographer, maybe get some help from one that is. It will really benefit you greatly by having good lighting, good composition, just appropriately displayed photos of your artwork in order to get accepted into a good art show. Assuming that you're applying for a high-ranking art show, that means the competition is quite fierce. There's a lot of people trying to get into these art shows. Therefore, you really need to make your artwork stand out. That also means use your very best pieces of work to highlight in your photos. Even if it's a piece that's already sold and long gone, as long as you're still making things similar to this piece, and that's the kind of pieces you're going to have in the show, then use those items for your jury slides or jury photos. If you really do feel like you are a competent photographer, you probably can do it yourself, but you really want to look at a lot of these nice photos that are online and keep that in mind. If you end up getting denied from shows multiple times, that's one of the things that you may want to try to adjust. If you took your photos yourself on your iPhone and you haven't gotten into a good show yet, you might want to reconsider having somebody else take the photos for you. You will also need a photo of your booth. I would say that's 99% of the time they require a photo of your booth. And I think the reason for that is, A, they want to make sure that you actually have a booth, but they also want to make sure that your booth is set up nice, that it looks good, and the aesthetics are working with the rest of the show. So if you haven't done a show before, you're going to want to set your booth up and get a photo of it, and make sure that you have that photo mass-produced or digitized so that you can easily have that online and available for all your applications. Make sure you're reading that application more than once. Every single one of these shows, I find that I can read it one day and then read the application again the next day, and I feel like I've interpreted something completely different from it. So make sure you read it more than once, twice, even 3 times. If you are not sure about what the requirements are, call someone, email somebody, hopefully there's a contact on an application. I've sometimes had some applications where there wasn't even a contact. And sometimes I had an application once that didn't even show the show dates. I would need to know the deadline date, and will I know in time before my other deadlines from other shows lapse? Because sometimes they won't let you know until right before the show, which then makes it impossible for you to produce more inventory for that show. So if they give a late notification date, it may not be the right show for me. Another good thing to keep in mind is making sure that you see their cancellation dates. Sometimes you can cancel all the way up until like a week before the show and get a partial refund. Sometimes you can cancel months before the show and get a full refund. So you'll want to look at those and make sure that that also correlates with all the other shows you're applying for, because there's no doubt that a lot of us, if you're doing this professionally and you really want to start doing a lot of shows, I may apply for a really high-ranking show, but as a backup, I may have a couple of other mid-level shows, just as a backup if I don't make it into the big show. I want to make sure I get the notification for that big show before I have to not get money back for the other shows. So there's a strategy involved that you're going to have to keep in mind if you're doing a multiple amount of shows like this. You want to keep track of then when is your final balance due for the rest of your booth fee. Often when you apply for a show, you will send in your jury fee. Sometimes they will ask for your booth fee. Sometimes they will ask for a percentage of your booth fee. So every show is going to be different again. And every single application is going to be different. So you're going to want to make sure you keep track of when you need to pay that balance if you don't pay it in advance. And I would rather pay at the last possible moment, but also not missing that deadline. Very important. If you miss that deadline, it's very likely that there's several other people waiting for that spot that have already paid their money and they're on a waiting list. So make sure that you don't miss that deadline. Another thing to check is there waiting lists? If you don't get into that show right away, you aren't selected as one of the main artists, you could be put on a waiting list, and that's great if you can get on a waiting list, but you'll also want to know where you are on that waiting list. If you are number 80 on a waiting list that's in a very high demand show, I don't know what the percentage would be of you getting into that show. I'm not saying that you wouldn't or you couldn't. There could be 80 cancellations. Somebody always has a reason for not making a show. Your car breaks down, you have somebody that gets sick, or you get sick. Or they decided to do another show because that was their backup show. So there's a lot of reasons why there's cancellations. You just got to be able to play the percentage game of whether or not you might get in that show depending on where you are on the waiting list. If you do get on a waiting list, it's not a bad thing, and it's actually could be a great thing, because you may end up getting a super great booth space that you didn't expect because they just put you in a spot of somebody that did cancel. And that happened to a show here for us. And we ended up being in a great spot that we ended up keeping or moving 2 booths over for many years after that. And they allowed us to do that because we ended up in that spot initially. You also want to consider electricity in your application. Some shows don't have electricity available, and the ones that do often will have an additional charge. So if you need electricity, if you're doing demos or you need particular lighting, you want to make sure that it's offered, and then make sure you're applying for it and paying for it in the application fee, and then also making sure that will also guarantee that you're applying for a booth space that has access to electricity. I also take into consideration the load in and load out. If they want me to load really far away and then I have to dolly everything in, it may not be a show I want to do. If it's a show that's really great and you know it's super reputable, then you might want to bite the bullet and dolly in your stuff. But you want to take that into consideration because it may be difficult for you. You want to make sure that you're physically capable of it, especially if you're doing a show by yourself. Here's a quick tip. If you're having a little trouble with some cash flow, try to find a 0% interest credit card that will carry all your booth and jury fees for the year until you can do the shows and pay it back. And lastly, as far as getting notifications and getting accepted and not accepted, it's really tough when you don't get accepted into an art show. And it feels really bad, and you often feel it's a reflection of your art. And usually it is not. Most likely it's because there was just so many artists applying and the competition is really high. There's also several other reasons why you could be rejected from shows. The biggest reason is getting your application in late. I find that a lot of people tend to get it right in at the very last minute, like the day before the deadline. And yes, that's what deadlines are for, and yes, it's perfectly okay to do that. But what's happened is usually these juries are meeting regularly as applications are coming in. So by then they're kind of tired. They've seen hundreds of other photos and read hundreds of other applications, and they may not just be that excited anymore. And they also may have already in their minds decided who they want in the show based on when they were fresh and they were looking at all the new stuff. So if you can get your application in early, I highly recommend that you do it as early and as soon as you possibly can. I think the other reason why I would get rejected from shows was initially for my photos. And I then, of course, decided to pay a professional. And as soon as I had professional photos taken, my whole application process was completely different. I started getting into a lot more shows. I also made sure I read the applications correctly and I put in the right information. Sometimes we miss things very simple on the application, and that's enough to get us disqualified. And that again is why I recommend reading the application a couple of times, if not 3 times, to make sure that you're meeting everything that they want from you. And sometimes watch out for weird things in an application. We've had a couple of times where we were asked to have a state sales license before we even were accepted into the show. We hadn't even applied, and that's what they required before we can even apply. And if that's going to be an extra expense or an extra hassle or something you just don't want to do, you're going to want to watch for that. Also, you're going to be very cautious about any other kind of things like the type of insurance that they may require. Most art shows should have their own insurance, but a lot of them require each artist to have another type of insurance just for liability and other reasons if someone hurts themselves in your booth. But generally speaking, you want to make sure that you can fulfill any of those requirements. You might need to show proof that your tent is fireproof. And so you're going to want to make sure that you can show that proof and have the paperwork available so that when you do arrive to the show, it's available to the fire marshals when they come by. There was also one show that I found very interesting that wanted actual photos of me making my work. And I found out later that this is because there were so many people applying that weren't making their own art. It was being produced in China or it's mass produced. I would make sure that I am not applying for shows that do consider and accept commercial booths, because I really don't want to be next to a booth that has kids' toys and commercial things that are obviously mass produced. And so there are some shows that are trying to keep control of that. And one of the ways was to show you making this, your work. I don't know how that really proves that you make it because someone can easily stage that, but I guess that was one way that they felt could help. So if you know that they require that as well, you're going to absolutely need to make sure you get a photo of yourself looking like you're making your stuff or actually making your stuff. So I'd love to know more about how you are finding your shows and any kind of weird things that you've come across in applying for a show, because I find those pretty cool stories. Please leave a comment below. Also, I'm really curious about any international people that are doing international shows and how you're finding those resources. Is there language issues? I would love to know more about that. So please leave a comment below. If you like art and you like wine and you like talking about creative stuff and being an artist, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. I love doing these videos. Make sure that you check out my other video, which is about how to find the right art shows. And thanks again for being here. Salud, and keep creating.